Cool. So I just want to welcome members of the UWA International Law Society, viewers. So before we get started, I want to just recognize the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting on today and pay our respect to elders both past and present. My name is Caroline and I'm the Publications VP for the UWA International Law Society. And this is our first video in a series that we're doing on careers in international relations and international law. And I'm honoured to introduce our very first guest, Michael Hilliard. So thank you, Michael.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
So just to introduce Michael for our viewers, Michael is currently the Director of Communications at Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs and the founder and host of the Red Line podcast, which is a podcast focused on geopolitical analyses of conflicts happening around the world. He has over a decade of conflict reporting and analyst experience, specialising in Russia, Europe, and Central Asia. So I just wanted to...
That's it.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, yes, Russia and Central Asia, which is, I guess, I'm the, it's the talk of the town at the moment, which is, hasn't been since the 90s. So it's interesting to be working in this field at the moment. Yeah,
busy time for you, I can imagine, which is really great because you must have a wealth of experience.
It's been very interesting watching all these sort of towns that I've spent time in over the years become frontline cities, which is always a interesting thing to go when you can, kind of identify a front line by the deli that, I've spent time in that deli and that bar. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, imagine. So just to start off, I guess you can explain sort of briefly your career so far, how you got started. Was it something that you knew you wanted to do from very early on or something you fell into? What was that process and journey like for you?
So I have a really unconventional path into this field. I've always been really interested in international relations. My father was a naval officer, so we were always discussing kind of international relations. And at the time when I got into this, I was actually writing for a music magazine, interviewing bands and doing that kind of stuff. And then I went to Moscow with a good friend of mine after a bit of a heavy night and probably a ticket I shouldn't have bought. And I really liked the region. I thought it was really interesting to see the other side that people weren't talking about a lot. And then from there, I went to Romania and met a guy in a bar who was a ghostwriter. So effectively, ghostwriting is where someone pays you quite a heavy amount of money to write a paper or write a book, and then you scrub your name off it, they take it away, and they pretend it's yours. So, in the early days, I was effectively helping these defense guys who had really, really dry defense papers and rewriting them to be more palatable for human consumption. Much more interesting, making it, actually explaining it in real terms, so it's not just a series of acronyms all the time. And then from there, I got offered to do my own, own assignments. So going into Moldova and Iran and Ukraine and effectively going in to report on a story or do some analysis work, both as a subcontractor or working for the UK government or, quite often going under ghostwriting, and then I'm doing some journalist work from there and writing defense papers. And then from there, when I came back to Australia for a bit and I started running the Red Line, which was kind of a side project at the time. It was just hey, I had this weird diary of, guys from the White House and CIA and KGB and, all these weird places. Why not use that? And the show kind of took off and did well. And I've been doing lots of analysis work since and doing stuff under my own name now, which is nice rather than having to write under someone else's. But it's been really interesting to I almost fell into the field, but have absolutely fallen in love with it since I started doing that. Yeah, awesome. So what would you say is a typical day for you, if there is even a typical day? Every day is completely different for me. So, some days I will... like tomorrow I'm starting my day at 6 a.m. and I'm on a couple of panels. I do lots of US and TV, so it's quite often middle of the night, which is always fun to 3 a.m. be talking about troop movements in Afghanistan. Some days I'm briefing congressmen on behalf of the think tank. Some days I am, editing the show and doing interviews for the show. Other days I'm doing lots of consulting work, which is a really interesting field to be in at the moment. Other days it's just sitting on the phone quite often with, you know, ambassadors and friends and colleagues and guys on the ground and kind of comparing notes. One of the sort of main things I did coming up, and I still do a lot of now, is being the kind of middle mixing board for everyone. You know, when, you know, like for instance, recently, you know, the price of wheat is going up due to the invasion of Ukraine. So obviously, you know, people who are watching that are going, okay, well, where's this going to affect? Well, it's going to affect Mauritania and Egypt. And then obviously, you know, myself having contacts in most fields, having worked in most of these countries, can go and talk to my Mauritania contact and say, hey, what are we likely to see? And then report that back to the Russian guys and go, yep, this is what we're going to see. And then report that back to the States and go, look, you know, this is what we're likely going to see across the entire supply chain. So it's every day is completely different. And some days you are deep in, you know, your office looks like a crazy person's map den full of, you know, frontline maps of somewhere. And other days you are reading, you know, stockholder business reports from some Guyanese port. It really is a incredibly varied world out there. And no 2 days are alike.
Yeah. Sounds really dynamic.
It is. This is what happens when you have a very globalized supply chain and world where, you know, a war in Ukraine affects the price of wheat in Brazil and Mauritania.
Oh, exactly. I mean, it's incredible, you know, with globalization, how everyone's connected, and just to be a part of that, it must be there's probably no boring day for you, which
sometimes reading the stockholder reports and white papers are not the most exciting days.
Oh, they're really, the really dry language can probably.
Oh, yeah. Yep. It's a bunch of acronyms all day. So that's sometimes that gets a bit boring, and doing lots and lots of videos back to back can also have it sometimes grating on you.
Yeah, that's, oh my goodness. And then, I mean, that sort of answers my next question, which is what is the most exciting but also most mundane part of your job? Sort of went into that a little bit.
So if you'd asked me the question a few years ago, I still kind of feel it, but obviously being on the front line and doing frontline reporting when you are getting, you know, shot at and there's guns and bullets and shells and, you know, you're in the trenches and you're making these key decisions like, do I wear a flak jacket, you know, because that's going to attract more attention to me, or do I wear casual clothes, which is I'm more likely to slip in and out. But if I do get shelled, well, you know, the shell's not going to matter. You know, those are really exciting times. And those are times I look back kind of fondly on, but obviously at the time it's a little bit different. Yeah. You know, but then again, it's, you know, I don't think I want to do that forever. It is a very demanding job, and it's a very, definitely has its long-term tolls on you. Again, there's so many countries that have had cheap bullets and cheaper vodka. I've unfortunately spent too much time in over the years. But, you know, also it's very exciting to be on the front line of what's going on. You know, it is, you know, it got to a point now that when the Ukraine crisis kicked off, I had the ambassador on the phone with me about 3 hours into it and getting a bit of a brief on him and, you know, finding out what the US knew and what we were expecting and going forward with that. And, you know, being on the front line of it means you get the information right as it comes out, and you can start to piece things together and start to actually go, look, all these dominoes line up. There's likely to be a revolution in Kazakhstan on probably January 5th or January 6th. We think this is what's going to happen, and being able to effectively almost predict the future, although with geopolitics, you never can perfectly, but being able to kind of see things before they come and make decisions and meet with all these people is really interesting. Also just authors and in ambassadors you look up to and meeting them behind the scenes and finding out there is they're as loosey goose as you are. Yeah, it must be quite incredible to sort of see those things unfold as well as you're living it, being part of that instead of, I mean, oftentimes studying international relations, we look very much at the past and we can see everything happening because it already has happened. But with your role, you can never really know what's going to happen the next day because it's just very much unpredictable a lot of the time. But understanding the past is the key to understanding the future. You know, a lot of these countries follow particular patterns or management goals, leadership patterns, or, you know, how their doctrines are set out to do things. So, you know, without understanding, as much as people want to look at the future, it's the guys who understand that, hey, look, when Kyrgyzstan goes through this kind of period of instability, they're likely to see a revolution. This is the key, you know, here are the 5 boxes that if we tick 4 out of the 5, then, you know, saddle up kids, we're going for it. You know, that's something you learn from studying the past that will predict the future. So as much as I think a lot of international relations students, including myself, are, we really want to learn the future, it's most analysis in the real world is writing down what happened in the past and making extrapolations about the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so what was it about, so when you say graduated high school and started to look at studies, what was it about international relations that really attracted you? Were you always, say, interested in history? What was it?
It was understanding the other side. What I found really interesting, and that, why I brought up that trip to Moscow at the very start, is it was a complete different kettle of fish. I grew up in a military household where obviously he was an officer mostly during the Cold War. So the Russians were the bad guys. They were, the big bad guys, and we knew nothing about them, and, yada, yada. But going to Russia and then speaking to Russians gave me this complete other side of the picture, which, I was a music journalist at the time. So it was completely weird to get this, like, okay, none of what you're saying matches up with any of my proclivities of what I think is going to happen, and that kind of inspired me to go, cool, well, there's obviously going to be two sides to almost every story. Let's go find both and start to actually work out where the truth sits. Yeah. And that's what, that's what really kicked me into it is looking at these often misunderstood countries, or often, not really understanding and going through and trying to get a hold of their psyche and to go, okay, I get why you're doing that. I don't agree with it, but here's their point of view. Here's my point of view. It's probably somewhere in the middle. And I think, if you just focus on one side of the story, you only get about half the story. Yeah,
for sure. Definitely. And I suppose, like you were saying, it's almost like demystifying the other side as well, to be able to find a solution, peaceful solution, preferably.
Of course, you're not going to be able to try and, convince someone or something else if you have no idea where that opinion's come from. If you're trying to, for instance, with Russia, everyone kind of goes, well, why does World War II matter? If you're from Australia, if you're from the US, the World War II is kind of a thing in the past. Whereas in Russia, it is a really, really big thing to them. You have towns in Russia where there is two buildings. One of them is, effectively a convenience store, and the other is a monument to the Great Patriotic War. It's really interesting that things like that you don't get until you go in the field and you start talking to people and you go, okay, wow, this is a lot bigger deal in your subconscious than it is mine. And I have to now put that as a weight into my calculations when looking at sort of how Russians might react to things. Stuff like that you don't get unless you're really, really interested in this field. Because you don't get it when you do a 90-second piece on, CNN where they quickly run through things.
Yeah. So do you think your experience and studies have really helped you in your roles now, being able to understand?
Very much so, because obviously, some of the, the very 101 stuff is, you kind of end up going through it a little later on. But, it's the foundations of everything you have to understand. You understand things like countries doing things, that one thing that really stuck with me is that countries kind of do things with the hand of cards they're dealt, that every country has its own objectives. A lot of people, including myself before I got into this, was like, well, the world just does things because things happen. Whereas then you go, okay, Argentina has a specific set of things they're trying to do in a specific whole geographical outlook just for them. And so does Paraguay, and so does Kyrgyzstan, and so does Germany. And trying to work out, using the sort of theories and techniques you learned there and build effectively a profile on, here are the top 4 or 5 things Germany really thinks are important, is something that if you don't learn those basics and fundamentals, you won't understand why gas is so important to Germany or why the European Union functions the way it does.
Oh yeah, definitely. Sort of the personalities of each nation.
That, and also shoots are also great because you can road test a lot of dumb ideas. And I think it's better to fail with a question in a shoot than it is to do it in front of, a very serious contact or on television or anything like that. And it's good to kind of go, here's what I think. And then you'll have someone in the room, in a non-judgmental way go, yeah, like that's really good, but you really didn't take into account the Baltics. And you go, okay, yeah, I didn't take into account the Baltics. You can go home, you can study and go, yeah, no, he was completely right. I'm wrong. Cool. And you can take that and learn from, and I guess it's much better to fail on a small scale than it is on a large scale. And I think it's very important.
Yeah. And so how do you see your role like currently in the grand scheme of international relations? And do you think that media is still, there's questions of that it's becoming less and less irrelevant, but it's also more and more polarized. How do you see your role in that as a way of continuing this understanding of nations?
I think it's really, you can write the best foreign policy paper in the world, but if it's so boringly written that only 4 people read it, and those people have already made up their mind because they're already working in certain fields, it doesn't matter. It really isn't changing the world. If you actually write something that is more consumable for the general public, or even longer form, or really, goes out into stuff, you actually get people information to make better decisions. Even if it's someone who isn't working at DFAT, but they're working at the Department of Energy, and they go, oh, okay, maybe, we should probably look at this pipeline because those countries are unstable at the moment. And you think, well, he would have never learned that unless he was really into geopolitics. By making it accessible to a lot of people, that's what we're trying. That's the whole aim, is to try and make the decision makers actually make better decisions, because international relations affects way more than people think. It's, you poll the average voter what their priorities are, and international relations, foreign, is way down the list. But to be perfectly honest, with a country particularly like Australia, where we have very low reserves of quite a lot of things, and we're very reliant on trade routes, and we're very much a middle power in a lot of alliances, international relations affects our day-to-day dramatically. And it's really is the key to a lot of things, when people just kind of brushed aside. As for the governments right now, because of the fact that everything's becoming a bit more tense, governments love using middle grounds at the moment. They love using think tanks. They like using middle sort of guys they can have a degree of separation from before negotiating, because there's a lot of problems at the moment where, if you're on Twitter and you get, a government, employee for the US is caught leaving an Iranian embassy or leaving this, that can be a big international story. But if you have a middleman to, hey, I'm going to send in this trusted guy from a think tank or a journalist or an academic, he's going to go talk, kind of feel them out and go, if the US were to propose this, what would you do? And kind of almost figure out where both sides sit before they can go back. And then the official sides can come together and shake hands. And I think that's an increasing trend in international relations at the moment. So both, governments are doing more, it's becoming more important, but at the same time, media is more important because more people need to know how globalized our world is at the moment. And at the same time, it's really important to have these back channels and journalists breaking this news so it doesn't live in this darkness where, people ignore what's happening in countries like Yemen and in Central Asia.
Yeah. And how do you feel about the difference between, say, more mainstream kind of media outlets, like on TV, like network media, compared to, say, smaller local reporting? Oftentimes, people tend to only get their news and their understanding of what's going on in those big corporate networks. So what would you say is the most effective in bringing out the truth? And
so I think it's a tough world, for someone like an Al Jazeera, they, who was more international relations focused, they have a little bit more leeway. But if you're CNN, you're very much driven by ads and advertisers. So you need to make sure that you can make it poppy. And frankly, sitting there going, well, frankly, the economy of Algeria has gone up by 12%. It really doesn't really draw the viewers in. And a lot of time, even when I do, if you do mainstream television appearances, you'll be on there for 90 seconds. Quite often that's your time frame, and they go, explain the Libyan civil war in 90 seconds, go. And it's not their fault. They have to kind of run through everything really quick. But the general public can't really learn anything but good guy, bad guy, shoot bad in 90 seconds, Whereas what we're finding with, podcasts and YouTube channels and this new way of a media where they can go really deep into it is that people who are interested can actually learn it. And there is so much information out there. Think tanks have got great shows, professors are doing stuff, journalists are doing stuff, and actually giving us access to really long form things. CNN has to cover everything from, a shooting in Chicago to, a duck that ate a pizza in New York, all in half an hour. Whereas, with this new line of media where you can go a bit deeper, you can spend half an hour on the potential geopolitics of a separatist Togoland, which is something that only me and 4 other guys in cardigans will ever be interested in. But it's incredibly important that somebody's keeping an eye on it. And that's what I think there is, this new space where people are getting used to longer form and getting more invested in these long and deeper stories than what mainstream press can do. And again, there is a lot of problems in mainstream press, but I do feel for them when, you put out a 30-second clip saying here's what Libyan civil war, and then everyone in the comments goes, well, that's not correct. That's over exaggeration. That's this. And you go, yeah, it is, but he's got 30 seconds. So of course it's going to be a very much trying to, paint a picture of something as you drive past it.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think there's definitely a hunger for more of that in-depth media analysis?
Very much so. Even in sort of your mainstream television programs, like, and I found it really interesting when John Oliver came out and did his show, and it was like one story for a lot longer period. That really kind of everyone went, no, that's going to die. And it just proved the concept. You have longer form audio doing really well at the moment because, even when we did the show, our shows are at an hour to an hour and a half long. And I kept thinking that's too long. No one cares. And then we realized that people actually just, they'll listen to it while they do dishes in car, dishes and drive places and go do stuff. Because as much as, I was thinking it wasn't going to work, that's how I consume media these days. Yeah. I'm incredibly busy all the time. My schedule's nuts. For me to read a newspaper or read a book or something like that, just for my spare time, that's really kind of difficult at times. I finish work at 2 a.m. I want to go to bed. Whereas if it's a podcast, if it's an audio, if it's a video, I can kind of do that while I'm in the shower or, driving somewhere on the train or on the bus or, it's, bringing sort of, rather than being on the news's time where 6 o'clock, you click the thing and that's where you get the brief, you're actually being able to consume it in your own time, your own fashion. I think that is the sort of the path forward here. Yeah.
So interesting and fascinating. So when looking like people who are really interested in this area, getting more into that side of media, what were some things in university that really helped you, or you can see now that really helped you enter this career path?
So obviously it's, university can give you a bit of a broad overview, but specializing is something that, you can go down past. And a lot of people tend to do that in international relations, as you either then end up this kind of jack of all trades who knows a little bit about everything, or you end up becoming a specialist. You end up being the expert on Turkmenistan, and that's all you talk about. And, he knows the name of the dog of the governor of this particular area of Turkmenistan. With university, you can actually, really, add the things in that aren't in the international relations course. You can add in economics, which is the next big thing that the buzzword is geoeconomics. You can add in some mineral stuff because, usually, international relations, you don't think minerals or geology is important until you start thinking about mining rights and resource trade. And you go, okay, yeah, that's way more important than I thought it was going to be. Since getting further into journalism, the more and more I get into it, the more I'm poring over introductory books into geology and whatnot, because I need to understand, okay, well, what's the difference between, fracking and horizontal drilling and vertical drilling and seeing what possible is out there, because that's where the industry is going. You particularly if you're specializing, you need to understand the world, diversify your course load rather than just taking a couple of set units. And I think university is great for that.
Yeah. And so what were some things outside of university that you could see that helped you, or potentially maybe you wish you did at the time and could have helped you even more? So when looking at maybe certain things students could do now to get into that line of work.
So effectively, you got to look at what think tanks and what people in the industry are wanting.
Mm-hmm.
For me, when I was really getting into it, it was the two things that really helped me. One, I had been, touring in bands and doing stuff, so I understood logistics pretty well because you're obviously shifting around lots of gear all the time. And two, it was media training and being able to use audio equipment. I can tell you that the amount of times I will be hired on, if a producer is looking between me and someone else to talk about Ukraine, and they go, well, Michael comes with great audio equipment. It'll be all well set up. He's well lit. I know that if I send him the email, he'll click the button and he'll be dead on time with a good mic setup. That, for a producer, it just makes their job easier.
Yep.
It's the added extras that, I'm probably just as capable of talking about this subject as the other guy, but it's the extras you do on top, whether it be learning media training, learning how to do social media, learning how to do a bit of graphic design, learning that are the added bonuses that tend to separate you from everyone else. Because if we're just talking, who knows Ukraine best, then Yeah, there's a gazillion guys who know Ukraine incredibly well. Being able to summarize that and put it in a palatable format is a completely different kettle of fish. And it's one of the things really lacking in the industry at the moment. So again, there are extracurriculars you think won't help you at all. But frankly, it was me writing in flowery language and music magazines that made the defense palatable that got me the jobs in the future. It really is, making your resume as diverse and weird and all these little skills that have helped more than anything. And I think, my audio, my first degree was in audio production, and that definitely helps with running the show and doing live crosses, as well as, being in the field and being able to, okay, cool, our tape recorder's broken. Let me think about how I can fix everything and make it work so we don't lose this piece we're doing. Yeah,
definitely. Totally agree with diversifying, because a lot of students these days, they tend to pick something that they want to study, and gone are those days where a degree was all you needed to land a job. It's so much more competitive and more difficult to really get into certain lines of work. And I'm experiencing that myself now, and seeing how those little things along the way that you just happen to pick up or you just sort of fell into tends to add to that.
Well, as a bit of an example of that, one of our staff who runs our kind of TikTok and a few other bits of the show, he'd be applying for jobs in the British government for almost 2 years, not a single callback. He joined the show and was kind of part of a show that he had media experience, that he could do, he could do social media platforms, that he could go and speak on panels. And he had a job in the Transport Minister's office as a communications director within a couple of weeks, because nothing changed in his degree. It was just showing that, hey, my degree is a degree plus I'm really good at this and this and this because I work for these kind of organizations. It really is about making sure that, every one of their applicants on the table will have a degree in international relations, but it's the extra little weird bonus bits. They go, actually, that's a really useful skill and no one in the office knows how to do that. So on board you come.
Yeah. And so what are some tips you could maybe give students watching or even young people watching, maybe who don't necessarily have a degree in international relations, where they could start acquiring, like, places they should apply to or volunteer, things like that?
Yep. So obviously the big push at the moment is media, because every think tank wants media at the moment. Every government department wants media at the moment. We are in a world where, when Ukraine invades Russia, the transport minister's office is expected to make a statement, even though that it probably doesn't affect him that much if he's in Australia. It's, if you're learning international relations, get a bit of a handle on everyone, start talking to people and getting a bit of a contacts list up your sleeve. You'll find that most journalists are pretty easygoing. Particularly if you're a conflict journalist, being pretty relaxed is what keeps you alive half the time. Reach out and say, hey, I'm a young student. I'm looking to, just kind of get into this. I'd love to pick your brains on, India relations. And you go, and, most journalists are just as nerdy as I am. And they will go, oh my God, any chance to talk about India? Let's do this. Come on Zoom and I'll chat to you about India. Trying to get published with some of these some of these up and coming papers. You can write 500 words and go, look, I'd love to get this published. And if it's good enough, it'll get published. And then you can say, hey, I'm published in X and Y and X and Y. And again, it's that thing that makes you, guy one or has a resume like this, and you have a resume, but you're also published here and here and here, and you can link back to stuff. And it just shows you've gone that extra mile and you've tried to do extra things, and you made yourself because if I'm hiring you, I can go, okay, well, that person obviously can write and they can communicate and they can reach out and they're a bit of a go-getter. It's far more attractive for me to hire someone who is already pushing and going for other things.
Yeah. So where do you see the industry going, in the future? Where do you see it heading? Very much.
The biggest shock for everyone was COVID. And it was really interesting because all the old school legacy, kind of really old think tanks who did these roundtable events, all the time, they all had to go online really quickly. And I think a lot of them are still struggling with that transition. So these young journalists who are on the ground reporting every single day, or, people putting out great content online that people are consuming, that's where the game is now. You want to reach more people. You want to be on the front line of stuff. You want to make sure that you're be a trusted source. And there's so many great outlets out there. These days you can actually get into places by effectively just running a YouTube channel or doing stuff and proving, hey, I've worked with all these people, I've done this and this and this. That's learning media and learning how to present stuff is an incredibly important skill, because unfortunately, quite often you find analysts, who are really, really good at their job, but can't really get it across in a, packaged way. They find it really hard to go on TV and, make an analogy or kind of break it down for an American audience or anything like that. Whereas, now there are so many roads that you can go completely technical. You can go to completely computer science routes. DFAT is picking up anyone who's, a journalist, foreign affairs, if you're doing computer science, if you're doing cybersecurity, it's such a diverse field at the moment, and they're looking for so many weird different options because of the fact that the whole industry is changed. It's no longer just, a bunch of guys, in a room who write one white paper and hand that to the government. Now you're expected to comment on everything. And, you're working with other governments, and you're working with other journalists, and you're working with, mining companies, and you're working with, transport companies who are trying to figure out where they should put their money, because we're in a globalized economy. That's what happens.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, definitely. And I think you were saying about just picking up on different things of skills where you can get from anywhere, because it all kind of comes together and it creates like a very unique you or a unique person, and that makes you a unique candidate for whatever you might be going for. So even things like social media, it's so central and core now to the media industry, or just really any industry now. How would you say, students could go about using their social media?
So obviously keep your social media clean. Don't, the amount of times that people have sent me resumes and I've gone for a bit of a Facebook stalk or a bit of a, Twitter stalk, and there's just nonsense on there. That's not great. But actually engaging and having, when someone, your comments, your engagements are really insightful, putting out there, not just spouting off every 10 seconds. I think there's a bit of a push by people to, try and react within 90 seconds. And again, there's no problem with taking up, an hour and reading into it, calling a friend and going, hey, what's going on with Georgia's, economy at the moment? Oh, that's what's happening. That explains why this is happening. And then making a comment. So making sure your comments are consistent, make sure they're well thought out. And effectively just showing that you have the ability to talk to people on a wide variety of subjects is really important as well. Social media is effectively what a lot of young people are hired in to do, because a lot of the old professors and academics who've been there for years, that's not their particular field of expertise. So being able to use social media and Zoom and set up, live panels and Twitter spaces and everything else is what these think tanks and everyone needs at the moment. But there's so little people who are really, really good at it. And that's a huge glut in the market, that a lot of younger people who are experts, they're Twitch streamers. They're great at just talking for, 17 hours about Minecraft. That's a really interesting skill to have, because you can just keep a conversation going. You don't let it die on air. Because if you're a producer on a TV show, you do not want dead air. If you have it's why when you interview and have a panel when someone's a streamer, that no matter what, they're going to keep that conversation rolling, and they're really good at that. And that's something that no one would have thought about a few years ago. But now it is that sort of really diverse range of skills that a lot of people coming up are having, that are going to be really important for media presence, as well as panels and communications and everything else in the international relations sphere.
Yeah. So social media literacy, you could say, is definitely so key in. And I think a lot of people, younger people as well, should really capitalize on that. So for your own career, where do you see yourself in the near future? Is there anything exciting coming up, projects, goals that you've set out? What is next for Michael?
So we're taking on bigger and bigger projects. Obviously, the show's doing really well. We crossed 10 million streams a couple of weeks ago. We're now heading very quickly towards the 100 million, which is pretty insane to think about. That 100 million people are listening to the show. We're on more panels. We're doing mini series. At the moment, we're off to shoot I'm off to shoot documentaries in Central Asia at the end of the year, being asked to speak on the stages and conferences and whatnot. And it's lots of big things coming up. But generally, where the world's going, consulting is huge. If anything, consulting is what the majority of my work is. When I'm not doing my actual day job, which is working at a US think tank, which for me is kind of a night job because of the time difference, which is odd. But yeah, effectively, it's really interesting to sort of see how much companies are realizing that, hey, we need to figure out what's going on in this country, and Googling it on Wikipedia is not going to be enough anymore. We are in a bit of a upcoming period of instability, and if you're going to be investing a $50 million mine site somewhere, you probably want to be speaking with experts in that country to figure out where it is. So if you have dedicated your life to be the expert on sort of the western, very far west bit of Africa, then congrats. Like, you can have a bunch of mining companies not sending you emails being like, hey, we'll pay you squillions of dollars an hour to, tell us which part of Africa we should avoid and which one we should invest in.
Wow, very interesting. Yeah, it sounds like exciting stuff. Really, really cool. Well, thanks so much, Michael, for coming on to the series and, just joining the UWA International Law Society for discussing your career. Was endlessly fascinating. I think we could probably sit here for a lot longer. But how can people access, say, the Red Line podcast and your own socials?
So I'm on Twitter at Mike Hilliard Oz is in Australia. Otherwise, the Red Line you can find on the Red Line Pod on Spotify and Apple and Google and all the fun stuff. Oxus Society is obviously on Twitter as well. They're just sharing stuff about Central Asia. So if you are as big a Central Asian nerd as I am, which, again, I love talking about Central Asia. I don't think my partner is as interested about hearing the internal machinations of the Turkmen politics as some people are. But again, it's international relations. It's if you're into that, really into that, and as an IR nerd like myself, then it's check out the podcast, check out Oxus Society, check out the Red Line, and some of our great writers who are putting out lots of analysis all the time. And yeah, otherwise you can always hit me up on Twitter, and more than happy to answer any questions there as well.
Awesome. Sounds great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for everyone listening to this. It was really great. Thank you.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.